That is a little nerve-wracking because, that there's not a whole lot holding them to that property, but that's just the way the loans are structured right now.
That was one of the biggest risk factors in defaults and foreclosures, I think. Isn't that right? That if the lower the down payment, those were more often people who had problems.
Absolutely, because in that instance, the lender, or at least the investor in that situation, has to assume more of that risk. So really, what they're looking for nowadays is for the, for that potential or prospective homeowner to at least come, with some skin in the game, to have, to take on, at least take on some of that risk, at least in the purchase process.
Well, but I would argue that, the investment, the down payment investment isn't necessarily going to determine whether someone's going to be a successful homeowner, because if you look at the VA loan, which has a 0% down payment requirement, it's one of the more successful loans and has one of the lower default rates, when you look across all product types. So, when people talk about, do we need to go back to 20% down versus what we enjoy today, 5%, 3.5% on the FHA loan, what we've got to look at are people credit qualified? Do they have stable employment? These are the factors that are going to determine if someone's going to be a successful homeowner, not exclusively the amount that they're putting down on the home.
Yeah, that's really the question, I guess. Biggest mistakes that people have made, or the biggest, most common reasons that people can't make their payments and default.
Yeah, I don't agree. And just as Nate said, we talked about it earlier, the student loans, and we saw some of the tweets while we were on break, concerned about that part, and I don't want to scare first-time buyers or folks being in the market. You may have student loan debt, and the key is buying within your budget, right? And even if the rate was still low, or they didn't have enough of a down payment, is you do the affordability factor. St. Louis has extremely affordable housing, whether you want to be in the city, in an older home, in an older brick building, or versus out in the county, you can still purchase your home with student loan debts. Is just the key, the affordability factor. And
I kind of forgot about that in this whole discussion, that from a national standpoint, this is a pretty good place to move to and buy a house.
Right.
So
I want to make the point that's very important for the region as a whole in attracting and retaining jobs. One of the things that economists have found that really the most important thing explaining why the Sun Belt has boomed is low-cost housing. And to the extent that we can make or keep our region affordable, that's going to be a very big advantage for us.
yeah. I wonder, I look at these, I always look at these things from my own point of view, and there's a certain generation of my parents who they saved. Now, not everybody from that generation saved, but they saved more than we do. But they also had low-cost gas, right? I mean, cheap gas, GI Bill, and then you grow up in that and you think, well, I'm going to get that too, right? I should just step right into that. I wonder if you get that sense that you got to tell people, don't look at that house. Just because that's the house you grew up in. You got to look at this house.
It is a tough conversation sometimes to help people understand what they can afford and help them, be comfortable with what they can afford. So that's part of the process.
Absolutely.
And I think it also speaks just to the home buyer education, the prerequisites of actually enduring and actually going through that process. It's learning how to make the other household budget, knowing when you're overextended, and knowing if you have a deficit versus a surplus. So it's actually managing the household and home buyer education. I would definitely advocate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people are first-generation homeowners, and that makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
A huge difference, because they don't have the experience that others may have had with home ownership. They weren't living in a home growing up where their parents owned that home. So it was a completely different education process for them to be that first-generation homeowner. And that does require, I believe, a tremendous amount of education to really understand what that means, and so that everyone's taking that seriously.
Yeah.
It would be interesting if there was some kind, well, we don't want to, add any laws, but if there was some kind of process where people learned how, I guess that's what you do at Beyond Housing. You're educating the consumer, and that's what I do as a realtor. But one of the reasons that I take my profession so seriously is because the first home that my husband and I bought together wasn't a great experience, and we didn't know what we were doing, and we didn't have that conversation with our professional.
Yeah.
So
How many pieces of paper do you sign when you buy a house?
so many. So many.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely.
You just hope.
Right.
You haven't signed away your first child or something.
Right. It would be interesting to just continue to flesh out that conversation of what we could do for, St. Louis as a whole. How can we educate our consumer?
I think the financial literacy issue is huge in terms of, again, when you look generationally, the acceptance of credit cards as being sources of money as opposed to sources of credit.
Well, there is a trend moving that way, Jim, just FHA is considering either for all their loans, a home buyer education, or more importantly too, as Eric mentioned too, to sit down one-on-one with that borrower first and do the home ownership advising. Nationally, it's looked at much lower rates for first-time home buyers that come through a comprehensive program through the various counties, and they have a one-on-one conversation with a HUD counselor and an advisor, and just to really do those things that you may not have done in terms of looking over the affordability, the spending plan, the student loans, the credit cards, and they're considering it, seeing home ownership advising, at least for this one segment. But of course, I think education matter
For everyone.
for everyone, yeah, would be key.